Okay, Central and South Asia. We now move into an area which Europe had very little awareness of, uh, except occasional things like Alexander the Great stomping through the part of this region until relatively recently. And so when the sort of modern world that we're a part of, sort of discovers, if you went to this part of the world, it's almost invariably within the realm of colonialism. So these were not part of what you might call as European historical relationships. Basically, the Ottoman Empire, before that Persia and such, had been sort of the eastern barrier of what Europe was familiar with. That's probably why they called it the Middle East. Actually, I never thought of it before. So when you get into the further sections of Asia, then these were all sort of part of the big question mark back and beyond. Occasional rumors, and occasionally people see something. There was trade going through from the 1400s when the Portuguese start to trade with India. But it's even in that context, it's almost invariably within a colonial context. So the Portuguese set up trade colonies like Goa in India, and the rest of Southeast Asia. Then pretty when the Dutch come in and start making again trading colonies, then the British and the French and everyone else comes in. But it's invariably with the idea of classic colonialism. You go and you exploit an area, take it over militarily, and then pretty much do whatever you want to with it. And there's no sense when you get into this region that there's any sort of intellectual value in the place or in the people that you should pay some attention to. So one of the trippy aspects is if you actually get involved in looking at, for example, trying to figure out what was going on in India between, say, 1500 and when the British sort of take it over around, early 1800s, you find there's actually very little documentation. Never mind the fact that the Europeans, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, had been in this region for 300 years by then. Almost no one writes anything. And when they do, it's purely within the aspect, well, I had to go beat up on so-and-so because he wouldn't sell me what I wanted. And so what you find is and the reason very simply is there was very little interest by Europeans, i.e. back in Europe, about these regions. These were areas that were mysterious. And they still have that connotation today. When you mention something like Sri Lanka or India or Nepal or Uzbekistan or something like that, the classic image, both in North America and especially in Europe, is that's still the back of beyond. I mean, Nepal is probably the stereotype back of beyond place. So we're now in a part of the world where Europeans only perceive the region, in some cases still do only perceive this region as a place that they can use. They're not seen as political alternatives or equivalents to European states. European states saw themselves as owning this area. And the huge majority of Central South Asia was owned by the Brits. And you go a little further north, it gets owned by the Russians in the 19th century. So this is an area that there's a very different type of relationship with the Europeans. The reason that becomes important is simply because, of course, this class is basically a European class. The folks that set up the American educational system are Europeans. So in that context, when we look at this region, if you notice, there's almost no discussion about the dynamic past that occurred prior to European colonization. I mean, these are incredibly complex regions. You could spend easily a whole semester just on the history of North India dynamics, but not part of this class. And to be honest, it was never part of how Europeans saw this region. And even today, I think there's actually very little tourism in this part of the world that's actually tied to history that's pre-European. There might be some of it in it, but even then, it's always labeled as exotic. So you go to some, Rajput, palace, or you go to some Mauryan temple, but it's always with the idea of the exotic. You're not actually seen as something that impacts or relates to you. It's the classic sort of other, as we call it in tourism. So when we look at this region, what we find is, let's segue over here. Oops, can you switch over here? No. Okay, wait, let me stop this and make sure I've got the right one. Okay, so I'm never really too sure if you guys see what I see. Okay, so we're now here, basically from the area of Kazakhstan, sort of over here with the border of China being sort of the eastern wall, if you would, of this. So basically, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and everything west till you hit the quote Middle East, which is confusing because this is the Middle East when you think about it, or Middle Asia. So it's this particular region here. Now it sort of divides into two sort of really big general areas. In the northern part here, north of the Himalayas, what you have is your steppe region, which is now, much of this was part of the southern Russia / Soviet Union, these new independent states. These areas actually have a fair amount of oil too, which they're just starting to realize. There's actually a fair amount of resources here that literally weren't really discovered until the 1960s, 70s. That shows you how much back and beyond this region was. Even the Soviets really didn't think to exploit these resources very much because they just, to be honest, I don't think they even bothered to see if they were there for till really late. So what you have in this northern region, this is sort of the stereotypic area that actually is oftentimes labeled with these guys. This is your part of your steppe region. So what you've got is enormous, relatively flat expanses, relatively little water. Most of this area is covered in grass. And so this is your classic pastoral area. So a lot of this region consists of populations that moved around traditionally on horseback with herds of animals, in many cases yaks, for example, but also cattle and other stuff. And they basically survived on this landscape by moving around on it. So a lot of this region wasn't sedentary. These weren't folks that were sitting down in large cities. There are cities here, but most of the population was moving around and were nomadic and highly mobile. This is basically the western half of what becomes the Mongol Empire. And to a certain extent, well, actually a large extent, a lot of the folks that actually are called Mongolian when they go into Europe or, for example, invade and take over West Asia, those folks are actually from this region. They're not actually Mongolian per se. They're Uzbek or Kazakh or Kyrgyz. In fact, Kyrgyz are one of, I think, the biggest groups. So this is an area, the north is highly nomadic, relatively small populations, enormous open expanses. Now what happens is here you got this border, and here you've got the Himalayas coming across here on this enormous chain of mountains, this mountain range coming across here that basically just partitions the southern part off from the rest of Asia. So basically on sort of almost three sides closes off the Indian, which is usually called the Indian subcontinent, from the rest of Asia. So one of the side effects of this, in this particular area to the west, here you've got the mountain, let's do it this way. Easier to see if we put it in. So what you've got, if you notice here's your Himalayas. So in that context, what happens is the area over here is very, very dry. Again, this is our classic, West Asia, Middle East situation. So this is all, based on a few rivers and very little in the way of water. And that acts as an enormous barrier. Your desert regions here make it very difficult to move back and forth. Coming north and south here is just an absolute nightmare. Himalayas are some of the most, inhospitable, mountains on the planet. So what that means, this area here sort of does its own thing. It's basically got a fence on three sides. And what you find in this particular region is the Himalayas, one of the other side effects of the Himalayas is they're a great water catchment system. So enormous amounts of moisture that come across here get stuck in here as snow and ice, melt in the summer, and then drain rivers both here and also this way. So this particular region, for example, the eastern part of this generates the rivers that basically feed China in this particular region. This section of the Himalayas here feeds the rivers that feed Southeast Asia. This section over here feeds the rivers that basically, provide the riverine systems that you see in India and to a lesser extent Pakistan. So what you find is this mountain chain is absolutely central. Not only does it provide a fence or a barrier to people like these guys who are running all over the place to get across here, it's really hard to do. It also means, of course, you're not going to have a lot of trade going across here because you just can't move stuff. But also this basically, it divides the rivers. The rivers here go to the south. The rivers here go to the north and to the east, largely to the east. So the Himalayas are probably one of the most dominant physical features on the planet just because they provide an enormous amount of water for a huge proportion of the world's population. There's a fifth of the world's population here, and India is pretty soon, I believe, in the next 5 or 10 years, going to have more people than China. So between two of them, that's like 2/5 of the world's population just in these two countries. And Bangladesh, of course, is a stunning population too. So you got these enormous populations entirely dependent on this. Now, what you do have in this region, since we're now in this section here, basically dominated by the Indian Ocean, is you have what we call the monsoon. And so what you find in this particular region is that for a chunk of the year, usually about 2.5 months, on a very, very traditionally very systematic basis. So for example, I'll just arbitrarily say maybe from January to March, I can't remember what the monsoon starts. So you literally could almost say on January 15th, it'll start to rain. And you might be off by a couple of days or a week, but you won't be off by any more than that. So we don't have systems of weather like that on the rest of the planet. In this particular region, the monsoon basically is almost like someone turning on an irrigation sprinkler, and it stays on for a couple of months and then it gets turned off. And the key with this region is that when the monsoon's happening, there's an enormous amount of water coming down. And of course, in this region, it comes down then as snow. When you turn the monsoon off, then very, very frequently, that's 90% of your entire water during the whole year has happened during the monsoon. So basically, you're in a drought for 10 or 11 months, and then you've got enormous amounts of water for a couple of months. And so that water then moves down initially as floods, and then moves down through these riverine systems. And that basically is how you generate life, if you would, in this particular part of the world, is through the monsoon, the cycle of the yearly monsoon. Now, this is so central to everything that if the monsoon ends up early, then tons of people die in flooding, and there's an enormous disaster because that means they haven't planted the crops yet. So now they're going to die of starvation, 6 months later when the crops don't grow. If the monsoon shows up late, then the same thing happens. The crops were planted, but they die from drought before the rains hit. So when the rains hit, it's too late already. So this is a part of the world where everything's sort of on a timer because of the way the monsoon works. And of course, since people have been here for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years, everyone knows how the timer works. Now, one of the aspects of global warming that we don't think about because we're not in the system is it appears to be really messing with the monsoon timing, both when the monsoon shows up and how long it lasts and how much, for example, rainfall it's generating. Who knows how that's going to play out. There are historical records in the past in places like India of about, like 1,000 years ago when the monsoons just completely changed for a period of time. I would suspect, given the fact that it's part of the same wind system here, that when the jet stream changed here and basically screwed up this part of North Africa, I'm willing to bet that really messed with the monsoons for this region, but we don't really have any particularly good records. We do for China. The Chinese are very clear about the fact that this jet stream also messed up their climate for the next 400 or 500 years. So we don't know, but this is one of the most populated parts of the world. This is the part of the world that everything's dependent on agriculture. Like China, India actually imports a relatively small proportion of its food sources. So you're dependent on the monsoon because that feeds your population. If you're in Bangladesh, then they can't afford to import anything. That's one of the most densely populated places in the world. And they're entirely dependent on the monsoon because it's there. If they don't have the food, they starve. So we're now in a part of the world where if you're in the northern region, you don't have the monsoon. The monsoon's basically south of the Himalayas. But when you get into this region, this becomes life or death in terms of when it shows up and what the intensity is and duration of it. And so the monsoon's really critical. The other thing that you can sort of see here, if we zoom in a little bit, this is peculiar to India. Well, actually, let's go back just a bit here. When you look at this particular region, it's important to remember what you've actually got is what we call the South Asian plate. That's this whole chunk here. And what you've got here is the Central North Asian plate. Then we're now talking about plate tectonics, the huge, chunks of real estate that slide around on planet Earth. The North Asian plate's basically static. It's just sort of been sitting there. The South Asian plate is moving north. And here you can sort of see the plate dynamics. Here's the plate edge right here. Here you can see the edge of the Central Asian plate here with the Pacific plate. So this whole part of the planet Earth, basically India south, is moving north. It's not moving really fast, but it's moving, centimeters a year. And the thing is, it's moving, 365 for hundreds of thousands and probably millions of years. It's been crashing into this. So it's just a long, ongoing, permanent train wreck. As this part of the planet just pushes into this part of the planet. This doesn't budge. This doesn't quit moving. And what they do is they crumple, just like, like a car hitting a telephone pole. It just crumples. And that's the Himalayas. Now, one of the other side effects of this is that means that this zone is very prone to the various aspects of these type of activities, which are both volcanic and probably most importantly, earthquakes. So we now get into a part of the world where you've got enormous amounts of tectonic activity. And the Himalayas, along with the Andes and maybe the Rockies, I'm not too sure, are actually growing. So Mount Everest, whatever it's called now, is actually taller this year than it was last year because this crumpling impact is pushing those mountains up. So these mountains are getting even higher. Now, as we'll see a little bit, what happens in this region then is this tectonic activity means this whole area here, both to the southern part of this, in other words, the northern part of the Indian South Asian plate, And this part here, the sort of the bottom edge of the Central Asian plate, are in constant pressures as this one basically pushes underneath the plate that Tibet sits on, for example. So what happens, and this happened about 1,000 years ago, yeah, I think about 1,000 years ago, is that there was an enormous series of tectonic shocks as this entire region, as this plate here slipped a little further under this enormous amount. You're talking about chunks of the Earth's surface, for Christ's sake. I mean, huge amount of activity. And the end result of all this is this whole area popped up. So one of the sort of trippy aspects of this, which you can see a little bit here, is this particular region, what's called the Xinjiang region or West China region. This whole area here used to actually be very fertile. This is where oranges actually originally come from. And so what you had traditionally were rivers that started here and went this way and then flowed eventually down into China. And you can still see what's left here. And there's also large interior lakes. Well, when they had that enormous set of earth movements, earth shifts, what happened is the rivers changed direction. And so what happened is some of the rivers flowed north, some of the rivers started to flow down here. That's why you got all these lakes here. And a lot of them just quit flowing at all. And so within, 10, 15 years, you literally had, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people living here, that literally the river dries up. And, first they had earthquakes, so everything's leveled, and then there's no water anymore. You can still do, there's a fascinating amount of archaeology slowly being done, especially in this region, where you can actually go into a lot of this region, you can actually find what are cities that basically were abandoned 500, 600, 900 years ago, many 900,000 years ago. And there's still orchards there. There's still houses with everything because it's so dry without the water being brought in by rivers. Because you remember, you're north of the monsoon, you can't live there. But it's so dry that everything basically just dries out. So you can actually walk through a orange grove that died 1,000 years ago, and the trees are still there. The branches are still there because everything just desiccated, and whole cities just are in large part intact. You can actually find, for example, written documents on paper that are 1,000 years old here, and they're still pliable and in good shape because there was no moisture. So this particular region is a really good sort of memory point of the fact that these earth activities that are basically Mother Nature doing her thing can have enormous impacts on human populations. This was a powerful, important part of the world until that volcanic activity, that activity happened, at which point it just got wiped off the map. And it's still basically, not much of anything. This is the famous Gobi or Taklamakan Desert, one of the driest, hottest places on the planet. And so this is the huge issue you have here. You've got the timing of the monsoon and what it is and how necessary it is. You've got the fact that you've got enormous amounts of activity in terms of subsurface stuff here, which is, of course, if you remember back years ago, was that enormous tsunami that hit this particular region. So this is an area that's very complicated. And it's also tied in very, very different ways to nature than the areas we saw before. And the last of these would be part of this particular plate. In fact, a huge part of what's India. You can sort of see it here. If you look at the image of India, what you realize, this hill area is very dry, and it forms sort of a really odd-shaped triangle. This is called the Deccan. The Deccan is basically, probably at least 70% of India is the Deccan. This is actually a raised plateau that's about 800 to 1,000 feet higher than the rest of it. And you can see here where the plateau ends, then you've got this deep lower section, and then crash, it's where this particular plate hits that plate, and you've got the Himalayas. And so what you find is the vast majority of India, and you can sort of see it here, is pretty seriously not inhabited. India is a really big country, but the actual population is squashed around the edges because the central region is in large part essentially almost no water, and it's very rugged in terms of terrain. And it's not really sort of the image we tend to think of in terms of when people think of India. We don't usually think of it this way. It says something that there are very few roads, for example, that cross the Deccan, and I believe there's only 2 railways that cross the Deccan. So India is a huge country, but the weird thing is basically its main inhabited areas are its fringes. This huge plateau that makes up the majority of the country is very inhospitable to large amounts of human settlement, and so that makes India very different than, for example, when you get to China, where it's sort of the opposite. And so this particular region is a real complicated place geologically. And of course, that makes it complicated geographically, and it makes it complicated when it comes to things like politics. So, you know, it's a region, I think, especially for Americans and for Europeans, they don't know much about it. And, you know, you can usually see that in the poor way they handle foreign relations with the folks in this region because they just don't think about them very much. And that usually comes back to bite you sooner or later.